Welcome, everyone. I'm Chantal Boucher. I'm working at Bell Textron Canada as a manager in certification, but I'm also the VP for Canada at the Vertical Flight Society, and I'm the president of the Montreal, Ottawa chapter. So on behalf of the chapter, we're very, very proud today to present you this webinar about the Canadian Advanced Air Mobility Consortium, a national strategy for advanced air mobility in Canada. And our presenter today is GR Hammond. He will be introduced by Ken Schwartz. So just on the next slide, just want to talk a little bit about our Montreal, Ottawa chapter for a second here. So our main objective at the chapter level is to bring people together. So we work on organizing conferences or webinars these days, and we're focusing on the Canadian ecosystem, trying to offer more networking opportunities between the industry, academia, and other organizations throughout Canada for everything related to vertical takeoff and landing technology. And we also, you can switch on the next slide, Chris, we work very closely with our student chapters. So McGill University has been very active since the beginning of the year, and we also have Concordia University. And just a side note, McGill has been organizing a great case competition around agriculture challenges with drones earlier this year, all virtual. It was a very great initiative from them and a great success. So with that, I'm going to switch over to Ken Schwartz. Ken will be presenting our host today, our presenter, GR Hammond. And Ken is also part of our officer as the publicity director. He's one of the most knowledgeable people in the eVTOL space. He acquires knowledge covering multiple events, such as the annual Electric Aircraft Symposium at Oshkosh, conducting many interviews and in some cases visiting some of the players of the industry. So Ken is not only the president of Aero Media Communication, but he's also an award-winning senior aerospace marketing communications strategist and media relation professional specializing in the electrical VTOL, urban air mobility, aerospace, but also airlines, helicopter, tourist development, special event management, and museum development. So a very interesting career so far, Ken. Back to you now for presenting our presenter today.
Okay, thank you, Chantal. Let me just double check bear with me a sec, just want to make sure my first slide is up. I'm using, okay, very good. Okay, one sec. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Chantal. Since most of our media attendees are based outside of Canada and may not be familiar with Canada and the Canadian aviation scene, I'm going to provide some historical context for JR's presentation. The Vertical Flight Society has followed the Canadian VTOL story for almost 75 years, and there are some important market differences. Next slide. Okay. The important point of this page is that Canada is a huge country with almost 38 million people, and aviation plays a very important role in connectivity and always has. What some people may not realize is Canada is the world's second largest market for civil aircraft. It has the second largest civil helicopter fleet, and it has the second largest number of civilian pilots. And the aerospace manufacturing industry is also amongst the world's top 5 players when it comes to aircraft manufacturing and technology, as well as maintenance, repair, and overhaul. Next slide. The first aircraft in Canada was the Silver Dart. It was developed by Alexander Graham Bell's Aerial Experiment Association, which was a collaboration between Canada and the US. The aircraft first flew on land in Hammondsport, New York, and then flew off the ice in Baddeck, Nova Scotia. So right from the beginning, Canada was dealing with a different kind of operating environment from most of the rest of the world. Next slide. Aviation Canada was a solution to the challenges of geography and had to be highly adaptable for summer and winter conditions. As more roads were built, float plane fleet shrunk, and it shrunk still further with the introduction of the helicopter. But there's been a revival in seaplane service and a shift from industrial uses to commuting uses, with a focus always on downtown waterfronts. Next slide. Canada has the second largest civil aviation fleet. There's currently 36,887 aircraft registered in Canada as of last week. This graph just simply shows the growth of the fleet. Next slide. The Canadian helicopter fleet has also grown at a much faster rate than the overall fleet. Today, there's 2,884 helicopters in Canada, and they provide a wide variety of services across this huge country. Next slide. When we talk about British Columbia, which is the sort of birthplace of JR's initiative, if you're not familiar with BC, from visiting the province or taking an Alaska cruise originating in Vancouver, British Columbia is a huge territory. It's larger than California, Washington, and Oregon combined. As the slide shows, there's thousands of mountain peaks and thousands of islands. The coastline is very fjord-like, very much like Norway. There's a strong green history, birthplace of Greenpeace in the 1970s, initially to protest nuclear testing the Aleutians, and then it became an environmental movement. Most significantly for this presentation, British Columbia, if it was a separate country, would have the same size helicopter fleet as Germany, Italy, New Zealand, or Japan. So helicopters are very much a part of the fabric, and what goes with that is alternate modes of transportation, that kind of thinking. Next slide. The first aviation in Canada was focused on geography and overcoming areas without roads. When the helicopter was introduced, the vertical component came into play, which was flying in the mountains. And that's very much a part of the tradition in British Columbia as well. Next slide. This slide, are we seeing this slide for Camano? I just want to confirm that.
Okay. We are, Ken.
Okay, good. So the biggest aviation supported industrial project in the world took place in northern British Columbia, not far from Alaska, in 1951 to 54. It was called the Kitimat Camano project, and it consisted of a aluminum smelter and a hydroelectric dam in the middle of the wilderness. There were 40 heliports constructed within the site, including supporting the construction of a power line over a 5,000-foot high set of mountains. And the statistics were phenomenal at the time. Bell and Sikorsky highlighted Camano again and again to show the use of helicopters in an industrial role. And in some ways, this may be the beginning of advanced air mobility in Canada, because everyone moved around this vast site by helicopter. And there's some statistics. The lessons learned from that project were applied across the industry, and helicopters have become sort of part of the way of life in BC. As roads and modern transportation have developed, helicopters have developed certain niche, I would say, AAM markets. You have helicopters spanning rivers during freeze up and break up in the north. You have helicopter skiing industry, where helicopters are taking high inclines from the bottom of a mountain to the top in an almost commuting fashion. And you have even intermodal activity today, such as heli mountain biking, where you put your bike on a helicopter and go to the top of a mountain. Next slide. The idea of linking cities in Canada by helicopter goes back to 1943. That's when the service between Vancouver and Victoria was first proposed, but the inception came only on November 1986, when the infrastructure was put in place. Next slide. Helijet is regarded as one of the world's most successful helicopter airlines. They've been serving the route for 34 years. They've flown over 2.4 million people, and they've proven that advanced air mobility is possible with conventional technology. Next slide. The helicopter services in British Columbia don't exist in isolation. In many cases, they compete head-to-head with seaplane services. The market is mature in the sense that the infrastructure is in place. The facilities are right next to downtown within walking distance. And the unique aspect is over 500,000 people a year fly in British Columbia without ever going to an airport. They fly by helicopter, scheduled helicopter service, or scheduled seaplane service. The next revolution, as JR will highlight, is electric. And already a year ago this week, Harbour Air flew the first electric Beaver. I don't know if I said next slide, but and the final slide I have to show, here are the route maps for HeliJet and Harbour Air. And you can see that short distances with geographic barriers often enable innovation when it comes to air transport. Okay, give me one sec. Okay, now I would like to introduce our speaker, J.R. Hammond. Give me one sec here. Okay, sorry, I'm just difficulty seeing something. Sorry, I'm just having a problem seeing the notes I wrote on the slide. Bear with me. Okay, here we go. About our speaker today, J.R. Hammond is the Executive Director of Canadian Advanced Air Mobility, the not-for-profit Consortium. The Consortium is the exclusive unified voice for designing and implementing a Canadian advanced air mobility strategy in Canada. JR is also the founder of Canadian Air Mobility based in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. Canadian Air Mobility is a for-profit company mandated on activist-based investments in environmental and social ventures with AAM. Over to you, JR.
Fantastic. Well, saying a good morning to everyone from here in Vancouver, British Columbia, and an enormous thanks to the VFS team, both Ken, Chantal, and behind the scenes, Jim and Chris, for putting on the event today and giving us a platform to speak a little bit more about our work here in Canada as we wrap up for 2020, leading into the exciting part of 2021. We'll slide on to the next slide, and I'll just make sure that we acknowledge that we are broadcasting today from the unceded and traditional ancestral territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically those of the Squamish, Musqueam, Coquitlam, Katzie, Kwantlen, and Snohomish nations, among many others. One of our key aspects at the Canadian Advanced Air Mobility Consortium is to continue to honor our responsibility and duty of reconciliation within our CAAM ecosystem to further curate and harmonize the Indigenous wisdom into the equitable and inclusive use of our air resources, specifically when we expand with the advanced air mobility side. We'll slide on again to the next slide, and I want to make sure that we have an opportunity to pass on an introduction to myself. Thank you very much, Ken, for that introduction. My name is J.R. Hammond, and I am the Executive Director of CAAM, the Canadian Advanced Air Mobility Consortium, our federal not-for-profit based in Canada, designed specifically for the strategic and unified voice of advanced air mobility nationwide here in Canada. I'm also really excited to announce an additional member to our CAAM team. Chris Howe has been brought on as our strategic innovator, integrator, and supporting officer in really creating the CAAM ecosystem that we are excited to introduce and roll out for our 2021 strategic goals and projects today. Next slide. Over the course of 2020, we've had the privilege of bringing the CAAM Consortium together in creating an ecosystem and voice for how advanced air mobility can play out in Canada. What I'd like to highlight in today's conversation is a brief overview of our work completed to date in 2020, but critically, 3 key announcements that we want to bring to the media on this writer's circle in laying the groundwork for where we envision 2021 rolling out in Canada for advanced air mobility. Next slide. Fundamentally, our success has come from establishing and embracing our Advanced Air Mobility Index. We know that CAAM has created a rigorous framework to guide our challenging yet creative innovation process of our work in the AAM space. This framework builds upon the foundational goals of progressing advanced air mobility as a positive step forward for society and not designed for the benefit of one section of the socioeconomic spectrum. Building upon the existing transportation, public engagement, and urban planning policies seen throughout Canada, these are the 6 foundational ingredients that form CAAM and how we envision advanced air mobility playing out. The equitable, inclusive, resilient, intermodal, accessible, and zero-emission aircraft operations is how we utilize this framework in guiding our decision process through CAAM and through our engagement with strategic partners. Next slide. When we bring it to a higher level, our main area of focus that we want to communicate with the industry is that we are building upon a lot of the incredible and decades amount of work completed on that left-hand side of the slide, which is that of the drone, the UAS, or the RPAS industry, focusing on some of the micro remotely piloted operations and transitioning those learnings into the much larger advanced air mobility umbrella terminology that we focus on at CAAM. Our main focus within that black box in the center of the slide encompasses, yes, the media-sized urban air mobility aspect, but critically as well for the Canadian context, how we can embrace the regional air mobility connectivity piece within, yes, our dense urban centers across the country, but critically the suburbs and the larger remote areas of Northern Canada and our provinces as well. In order to create an inclusive terminology, we are not solely limited to that of the vertical takeoff and landing or the VTOL aspect, but ensuring our conversations expand to, yes, the short takeoff and landing for the general aviation and airport infrastructure across our country, and the conventional takeoff and landing, leveraging the partnerships of existing large-scale airport infrastructure, both in our cities and some of our remote areas. Critical to this box, though, is seen at the bottom of this slide. We are focusing on bringing the zero-emission operations into the Canadian context to ensure that we play a strong role in defining the sustainable aviation narrative of our future and accomplishing the decarbonization of transportation goals that the federal government of Canada, the provincial governments continue to roll out, and how aviation will play a role in that future. Based upon the success that we're having within this black box, we continue to expand to the right-hand side of the screen, ensuring that all the learnings, the insight, and the ecosystem that we've created continues to expand into the larger, greater range, higher carrying capacity of the commercial aviation industry as well. Next slide. As we've been working over these past couple of months to wrap up our year of 2020 and really set the vision for the industry going forward, we want to announce some of our 20-year vision goals that we have at CAAM to put that audacious, exciting, and driving force into creating the ecosystem and continue to push it forward. Next slide. The first goal that we have for 2040 is reaching this number of 40 billion. Specifically, by 2040, we want to successfully have 40 billion revenue passenger kilometers flown per year in Canada on zero-emission advanced air mobility operations. This goal will drive us to represent around 20% of all aviation-based RPKs by 2040 in Canada, compared to current projections by ICAO, and allow us to not only compete against the conventional airline industry, but really be a complement and step change for those carriers moving forward in the future. Now, to build it upon from the revenue, the passenger side, we'll slide to the next slide, and I'll elaborate upon our second goal for 2040, which is 40 million freight ton kilometers per annum in Canada by zero emission advanced air mobility operations. This continues to expand that we know the business system within Canada for advanced air mobility, yes, comprises the passenger aspect, but critically as well, building upon the cargo and remote and air services operations as well. Now, we know this cannot be done in silo. This goal is audacious and will be pushing us to our extremes to tap into the potential of where we envision advanced air mobility can operate. And on the next slide, I'll showcase the members that we've been able to bring together today on showcasing how this needs to be not only an industry solution, but bringing together the insight and research and development from academia, our national regulators and research groups, the 3 levels of government from federal, provincial, and municipal, and critically as well, the investors showcasing the different opportunities for accessing the private capital opportunities and bringing these projects to fruition. Next slide, we'll showcase some of our visions that we have for our starting and launch market of Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. Next slide. What we focused on in our work in Vancouver is creating a framework that we can leverage in bringing a 20-year roadmap through the Vancouver Advanced Air Mobility White Paper produced by Nexa Capital Partners in conjunction with our consortium and Crown Consulting, and documenting the different use cases of how advanced air mobility can play a role in the challenging, complex transportation solutions and problems of the Vancouver and British Columbia airspace. From this analysis, we were able to progress one specific revenue-generating use case that we wanted to test this framework out in building out both the environmental, economic, and social feasibility studies specifically for this work. On the next slide, you'll see our triple bottom line feasibility, which brings the insight from those 3 aspects on the economic, environmental, and social pieces to ensure that this framework does not hold back on any of the narratives required for building out a positive step forward for society in the advanced air mobility space. Now, as we pause on the Vancouver and British Columbia side, which we've been able to work on over the past year, it really allowed us to start creating a plug-and-play approach for some of our international partnerships, knowing that we're playing in a larger sphere. On the next slide, I'll showcase some of the aspects that we've been building upon, knowing that Vancouver is a starting point for sharing these learnings not only nationwide, but across borders as well. Next slide, please. The first aspect is leveraging Vancouver and British Columbia's connection to the Cascadia corridor, which we define as the Oregon State, Washington State, and Province of British Columbia connection coming out of the Cascadia Innovation Corridor. There has been a momentous movement coming from Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver on showcasing how we can lean into electric aviation, both in the VTOL and CTOL side, in connecting the 3 cities and showcasing how some of the largest tech companies and manufacturers on the planet, from Intel, Boeing, Amazon, Microsoft, Electronic Arts Games, Nike, among many others, can have a more effective use of aviation, specifically sustainable aviation, in moving people, goods, and services across the region. Next slide. Not only has that been specific to the region on developing the movement of people, goods, and services, but it's been the collaboration from the government side coming out with the Washington Electric Aircraft Feasibility Study produced by the Washington Department of Transport and the incredible work by the group on the DOT aspect, and leaning into how that collaboration looks on the British Columbia side, where we've officially submitted our documentation for the pathway to zero emission aviations by 2040 in British Columbia, highlighting how advanced air mobility will be playing a role in meeting the clean BC targets that the provincial government has laid out. Next slide. And to summarize it, we know that the future is Cascadia. The region has put the emphasis on that accessible, equitable, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable transportation modes for the future of our sustainable mega region. And we continue to lean in as leading members for providing insight of how the aviation aspect will play a cooperative role in conjunction with ground transportation as well in the region. Next slide. As we expand that to a larger international scope, one of the aspects that has become present is when we lean into the existing work being done around the world within the advanced air mobility space, and specifically with our recently signed partnership on the Nordic Zero Emission Aviation Group, bringing together the airport operators, the regulators, and the different airlines across the Nordic region, and showcasing how the legislation and policy can be shared across jurisdictions, specifically with the province of British Columbia, and as we lean into additional conversations with Transport Canada, and understanding that we do not have to create everything from ground up. There are beautiful existing platforms already in operation around the world that continue to share, build upon, and raise that level of water overall in the harbor to make a positive impact with advanced air mobility. Now, as a summary and moving forward to how we see this playing out in 2021, I'll lead into our first announcement for today's conversation. Next slide, please. We know that the success of what we've been able to showcase in Vancouver and British Columbia are a starting point for our conversation, but our true success will be shown if we can take this framework and quickly replicate it across the nation of Canada to ensure that this is effective and implementable in the nation across different jurisdictions. So I'm beyond privileged to announce today, next slide, that over the past two months, we've been working to launch the Greater Toronto Area, or that of Toronto, Ontario, Canada, for our second launch market in Canada for advanced air mobility, starting in January of 2021. Over the past 3 months, we've been bringing together roundtables of the provincial government, the local city officials, airports, academia, and investors within the Toronto region, showcasing and starting to brainstorm what advanced air mobility and how it can play out in the Greater Toronto Area, understanding the connection to Lake Ontario, the Northeast Corridor of the United States, and our golden triangle of Ottawa, Montreal, and Toronto can have a role in the advanced air mobility future of Canada. More announcements and updates will come in January 2021, so please stay in tune as Toronto will play a strong role of our conversations for advanced air mobility in the start of 2021. Next slide. Our second announcement that we wanted to share for today is how we are building out our strategic projects for 2021 and reaching out to organizations, government, and investors to lean in and understand the 4 key aspects that CAAM is committing to for advanced air mobility in the next year. Next slide. Our work has focused on number 1, the project for bringing a national advanced air mobility strategy and roadmap nationwide for efficient and similar understanding of how advanced air mobility is going to be rolling out. This is what we call as the national song sheet, so that we can all look and understand how individual city or regional operations play into a national strategy. This is going to be in conjunction with not only the National Research Council, Transport Canada, and NAV Canada, but leaning into what insights that we can have, having a nimble, alignable market here in Canada, and bringing the necessary decision makers from a federal basis together to create this national AAM strategy and roadmap. Our second project that we'll be focusing on is moving Vancouver to the operation stage for advanced air mobility operations with this cancer isotope use case. We understand that there's going to be a phased approach for building to the actual eVTOL or HVTOL operations for the cancer isotope, but building the foundation on a digital twin aspect, testing out initial operations within the dense airspace of Vancouver, and then expanding into the revenue generating operations in conjunction with our partnership with Helijet. This will be a key aspect for the Vancouver isotope operations in 2021. The third aspect in expanding in the Ontario side is understanding that there is a huge opportunity in bringing together the next generation of manufacturing for eVTOLs and HVTOLs in the Canadian context, understanding the synergy between the existing automotive sector in Southwestern Ontario and how that platform can smash together with aerospace and the modular, efficient, and digital manufacturing side that we hope to explore in some of our initial feasibility studies with the new partners we want to bring on. And lastly, number 4, building upon the framework that we've created in Vancouver, there's going to be a great opportunity in the Greater Toronto area to lean into the Advanced Air Mobility Feasibility Study, showcasing a white paper of the 20-year roadmap of how AAM can play out in Toronto, and critically as well, identifying the use cases that are essential for the next steps in advanced air mobility in the Toronto region. These 4 projects will be starting in January 2021, so please stay in tuned as we continue to recruit experts and operational expertise in bringing in the knowledge, insight, and collaborative opportunities for not only building upon these strategic projects in the Canadian context, but critically as well, sharing that knowledge in the home markets, expanding the knowledge, and having that raise the bar overall for the global AAM market. We'll go on to the last slide. And I'm super excited to announce on our final and third announcement for today's conversation, our new global partnership that's really going to build our platform to the next high level for the international collaboration piece. Next slide. We are beyond excited to announce that CAAM and Vancouver has become one of the inaugural cities for the upcoming World Economic Forum Advanced Air Mobility City Coalition. And this has been the incredible work from the World Economic Forum, specifically that of Harrison, Courtney Radcliffe, Timothy Reuter, and Matten Hillier, bringing together the next phase of what advanced air mobility on the city, policy, and collaboration potential can be in bringing together the World Economic Forum and the existing Advanced Air Mobility Forum and ecosystem that CAAM has created, and sharing that to the world. So these more announcements will be coming in February of next year, but we wanted to showcase that this is an opportunity to bring Canada's voice and where we see that an economic, environmental, and social aspect of advanced air mobility play out in conjunction with the platform that the World Economic Forum has created. Next slide. And as we bring to a conclusion of what we see for 2021, we want to ensure that this is an inclusive conversation and an invitation to the industry to continue to lean in to the work that we envision. Next slide. We've showcased in Canada with a starting market of Vancouver and British Columbia, how we envision advanced air mobility playing out and bringing it to a reality within the Canadian context. Our goals are not to be taken lightly. They are audacious, challenging, and will require the collaboration nationwide and internationally across industries previously having rarely worked together. This is our opportunity, and this is what we're committing to going forward. Next slide. So with that in mind, I'll conclude with the opportunity and the invitation. Please join us. We have our newly launched website coming up this week that will provide an opportunity for all of our insights coming out in January to ensure you're updated, maintained within the information side as we continue to expand not only on the 4 projects, but the global voice of how advanced air mobility will be rolling out in Canada. Last slide. So thank you very much once again to the VFS Society, specifically the Montreal and Ottawa chapter. And I look forward to diving into some question and answers as we build upon these next narratives and conclude 2020 on the positive note. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, JR, for that presentation and for the updates that you provided. For those that are tuning in, we are taking questions on the control panel that you all see on your screens. About halfway down, there's a box called questions. And I'd appreciate that if you would put your questions in there, and we'll try to answer all of the questions in sequence. We've got a few questions already from Brian Garrett Glazer, not unexpected. But I'm going to lead off with the first question, JR. I've been covering and working in the aviation industry in Canada for 30 plus years, and generally developments in this industry don't move that fast. If we go back a few years, the voice of Canadian industry, Canadian operators, was not present at any of the foundational UAM or eVTOL conferences. And now suddenly we have this very broad coalition having been formed. How did it happen so fast? What were some of the foundations, or how did it come about so quickly?
And this is a great point, Ken. And what I really wanted to focus on in our conversation is our main goal at CAAM is reaching out to the ecosystem and identifying the existing platforms that are already in place and operational, and showcasing how the next step to advance air mobility and understanding the municipal requirements of moving to that next step for both operators, the airlines, infrastructure, and the regulators of the country, showcasing that yes, advanced air mobility is the future, but we can build upon existing platforms to help make that transition as efficient and nimble as possible. And the second point behind the Canadian aspect, we're very privileged in the Canadian side to have a smaller market in comparison to the United States, where we can structure and organize the federal government, provincial and municipal side in a much more nimble way, such that when we are looking to expedite a vision or a strategy, it can be the key decision makers at that table to help expedite the processes and really have alignment in a unified voice.
So as you started knocking on doors, and I guess that's what you had to do, where did you start?
The critical piece is Canada supports the innovation, especially when we bring together a national vision. So the most success that we've had is leaning into engagements with the National Research Council of Canada, and specifically their aerospace division, who have been building upon the existing drone or RPAS platform for the past decade and a half, and seeing the potential of transitioning that knowledge, research and development, and their existing aerospace facilities between Ottawa and Montreal into this new advanced air mobility space. So it was leveraging the beautiful connections the NRC already had within Transport Canada, within NAV Canada, and in the provincial governments on just expanding that narrative to the advanced air mobility piece.
I see. Okay, I'm going to go to the first question from Brian. JR, what would your response be to citizens who say they would prefer to see this investment go towards public transit systems?
Mm-hmm. This is a great response, and where I continue to lean into the expertise coming from TransLink and the narratives from the city of Vancouver. We know that if we cannot prove that this technology is benefiting for society overall, specifically in fitting into the sustainability and public transportation goals of the cities and regions, we will not have a chance at any success. So what we're continuing to work when we look at those dollars for AAM versus public transportation is how to not create a black and white situation of an or, but what can we look at it as an end solution so that the dollar of AAM investment coincides as a complement to public transportation side. What does this look like with an air metro concept? The more efficient movement of goods and services within the Vancouver region in urban cargo per se. Those are some of the conversations that we focus on, and let TransLink continue to inform us and educate us of how we can ensure we're in alignment with their goals and the dollars that will be required for public transportation infrastructure.
Okay, again, a reminder to those that are watching, if you have questions, please put them into the question chat. Oh, here we go. I see, I'm sorry, my screen wasn't maximized, so I didn't see all of them. Very good. We'll go on to the next question again from Brian. Can you name any of the stakeholders involved in the Greater Toronto Area discussions?
So at this point, we're just finalizing all of the contractual pieces as we bring everyone together to ensure that we have a base that we can build upon. But some of the foundational conversations came from the Ontario provincial government, specifically the Ministry of Transportation, the Ministry of Health and Jobs and Economic Development, the City of Toronto, the Board of Trade of Toronto, the Greater Toronto Airport Authorities, which controls Pearson International Airport, the largest in Canada, as well as their partners with Billy Bishop Airport and Downsview Airport, located just north of the city center of Toronto, as well as the critical piece of the infrastructure and medical health sector within Toronto. There's been some beautiful developments in the drone and RPAS space for the movement of blood, organs, and additional medical materials. So I wanted to include them in some of the initial roundtables for our GTA conversations.
And how do you, just building on Brian's question, how do you anticipate the activity in Toronto will unfold? I'm sitting here in the middle of Toronto right now. There's not a lot of aircraft except your ambulances flying over the city since March.
One of our goals, Ken, on that side is knowing that the Toronto is a much larger and more complex market than the Vancouver and Southwestern British Columbia side. Our narrative is understanding that we have an existing framework that's been tested and tried in the Vancouver space that we want to replicate and localize for the Toronto side. So we hope to expedite the actual time of these initial projects for 2021, knowing that we can build upon the successes and learnings coming out of the Vancouver side. But for the operational piece, we expect a longer time frame for Toronto compared to that of the Vancouver side.
Very good. I'll go on to the next question. For those who aren't familiar with Toronto, one of the unique aspects, just to build on what JR mentioned, is the Toronto Island Airport, now the Billy Bishop Airport, which is literally steps away from downtown. You can walk to the airport. It's probably a 20-minute walk from my place. But since the scheduled service developed there, there's 2.5 million people going through that airport, and it's a remarkable hub in the middle of a city. It was also the template for London City Airport when de Havilland started promoting downtown city center airports in the Stoll era of the 1970s. Okay, the next question comes from James McLaughlin. I'll read it here. Helicopters are often point designed for specific payload, seating, range, or speed throughput metrics. These often drive manufacturer design studies. What segment do you anticipate for the CAAM markets? In other words, payload range, seat class.
So one of the key aspects, that's a great question, James, because the conventional design of the aircraft on the VTOL aspect has been that specific use case and payload side. What we are challenging the aircraft developers for this future AAM application is when we establish additional revenue generating use cases, how can that platform satisfy as many of those use cases as possible in being a mission agnostic case? And this is the complexities and what we hope to lean into on the manufacturing feasibility studies is what does it look like for near-term revenue generating use cases in the Toronto and Vancouver region for a platform or a combination of platforms to satisfy as much of those use cases as possible. So we are really not working on the aspect of limiting and defining the use case, the requirements per platform initially. We are focusing on identifying those revenue generating use cases and then working backwards through the supply chain in conjunction with the manufacturers. So it's a different approach that we're trying to take on the CAAM side and just keeping the options open as much as possible for where we envision some of the initial use cases to come out of the Canadian aspect.
Very good. I'll just add a little comment regarding the Vancouver scenario. For those that aren't familiar, most of the commuting activity that takes place off airport today is Helijet's 12-seat Sikorsky S-76s or Harbour Air's 6-seat, 14-seat, or 18-seat Twin Otters. So in some cases, and this is in contrast with other regions, there's already a small capacity frequency-based system in place, which is closer to UAM world than, say, the major airline world in terms of what you might see in Los Angeles. Okay, the next question comes from Matt Thurber at AIN. JR, what companies like Helijet already, are companies like Helijet already planning to adapt to AAM operations with new types of aircraft?
So Matt, fantastic question. And yes, Helijet has been one of the leaders in our consortium. Their CEO, Danny Sydenham, being a visionary himself, understanding the next development of the Helijet model in leaning into not only having existing Sikorsky S-76 operations with their conventional helicopters, but what markets and new revenue generating opportunities are unlocked when they introduce advanced air mobility aircraft into their existing operations? How does that look in the under 500-kilometer range from their operations in downtown Vancouver? And how can that hub and spoke model feed to the longer distance ranges that they're looking at exploring in the Washington state area, that of Seattle, Renton, Boeing Field per se, and then more in the Vancouver Island to their capital Victoria, Nanaimo, and further up north to some of the rural areas. So this is a quintessential aspect, and I would argue Helijet, being a visionary, is progressing that. But you look at the companies like Harbour Air on the fixed wing side, expansion on the Indigenous side with Esqueo Air, our world's leading Indigenous run airline based from Tierra Fraser here in Vancouver. These are some of the visionaries that are progressing this market and showcasing how AAM will play a role in their sustainable aviation future.
Very good. The next question comes from Jeremy Schreember, and I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. Jeremy asks, can you go into more details on the first AAM test case in Vancouver? How is the operation of Vancouver isotopes going to work, aircraft frequency, cargo, etc.?
So there is, we've spent a good chunk of 5 to 6 months, Jeremy, on producing those 3 feasibility reports, specifically on this cancer isotope use case. But on a high level, the reports are available and downloadable in the slides that we'll provide after. On a high level, we identified a specific use case of moving cancer isotopes from Vancouver's General Hospital in the center of Vancouver to that of Victoria's Royal Jubilee Hospital using an eVTOL or HVTOL solution compared to conventional ground transportation. Not only does Helijet already provide service for this route, they are paid by the provincial government for the renting of the Sikorsky S-76 helicopter, and we have showcased how bringing in an eVTOL or HVTOL solution on a daily basis for the carrying of a 50-pound container with around 1.5 pounds of the cancer isotopes can be produced in a more sustainable, economically efficient, and time-sensitive manner, knowing that we can move point to point with a lower noise profile and having landing and departing privileges from the downtown cores.
What's the time frame for that?
Our goal is throughout 2021 is to build the operational profile so that we can satisfy all the Transport Canada and NAV Canada requirements. We envision our for the end of 2021 to have a drone solution do test cases of moving that cancer isotope between the 2 hospitals, with bringing in an eVTOL or HVTOL solution for some of the longer routes in additional cancer agencies across the country by 2025.
And what's the distance involved right now?
Off the top of my mind, we're about a 23-minute flying time from Vancouver General Hospital to Victoria's Royal Jubilee, and I think it's about 76 nautical miles as the crow flies.
Very good. We have 10 minutes left, so I'm going to blast through the next questions. Next question again is from Brian. How have the triple bottom line studies been received by local stakeholders? Are city officials pleased with the outcomes, the expected job creation, etc.?
And thanks, Brian, for bringing this up on the triple bottom line side. Our narrative that we really wanted to push out with the release of these triple bottom lines was an invitation and our first attempt in showcasing where the bar needs to be on asking the questions and some of the results that can come from advanced air mobility. We did not want to show up in the industry and say, here is the perfect model for rolling out a triple bottom line feasibility study for advanced air mobility operations, but rather an invitation to the experts and to the AAM and aerospace industry saying, here is our starting point. Let's build upon this to make sure that we continue to improve and create a robust model as we progress in the future. So coming from the city, the province, and the federal government, these narratives have been resonating on understanding that the framework and where we need to actually start questioning, we're not just solving out these solutions on the ground, but leveraging that 3D space above us and creating jobs at the same time whilst fitting into our sustainability goals. This has been the narrative that we've been receiving back and understanding how to start structuring that into their capital planning budget leading out to the decades of 2030, 2040 plus. So Our goal has been a success on receiving positive insights and people willing to build upon these frameworks as we go forward in the future.
Okay, JR, we have, I guess, 9 minutes left and almost 9 questions. So what I'm going to have you do is give some really concise answers so that we meet everyone's expectations here. Next question comes from Katrina Gilmore. What sorts of policy changes are you considering to support the implementation of this technology while considering needs and concerns of citizens? And we'll give some quick answers to these ones.
Policy. Continuous sustainability goals and requirements, province and federal wide, additional funding for research and development, and testing corridors within urban and regional areas.
Okay, next question comes from Pat Host. And it says, does the CAF, and I believe he means CAAM, desire to buy eVTOL aircraft, or are they spending money on eVTOL technologies through R&D efforts or any other avenues?
So thanks, Pat, for that. The consortium itself is not focused on the purchasing or leasing of any vehicles or aircraft. That is done by the operators themselves. Our goal is producing revenue-generating use cases for the ecosystem to build upon.
Okay, next question from Matt Thurber at AIN. Jer, how will AAM aircraft be able to operate safely during inclement weather, especially during winter?
Great question, Matt, on this. Leading into the NRC and what they've been producing on their icing facilities and operating in adverse Canadian winters, if our statement is if we can prove it out in Canada, then it can be operated anywhere in the world. Leaning into the manufacturers on saying Canada is an opportunity for shipping how these vehicles and aircraft can work in the Canadian winters, not something against us. That's what we're trying to progress forward.
Okay, next question from Alfonso Lopez. You mentioned manufacturing. Are you collaborating with the Canadian Composite Center in Canada to collaborate on technology for next generation manufacturing for higher volumes of aircraft?
Alfonso, that is a strong yes. Not only the composite group throughout Canada, but the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association of Canada, knowing that there's existing platforms on the auto and aerospace and composite material side for moving forward quickly and efficiently.
Next question from Katrina Gilmore. Are you planning any specific public engagement projects to inform, prepare your citizens?
Very much so. We have a public engagement strategy that we'll be rolling out in 2021 for Vancouver and then expanding to Toronto. That engagement is key to success.
Very good. We have 3 more questions. If anyone does have another question, please put it into the question box now. The next question comes again from James McLaughlin. What is the timeline for the development of use cases, and who are the transportation analytics stakeholders participating in the development of those use cases?
So to comment on, James, the ones produced in Vancouver, the lead analytics team came from both Nexa Capital, Crown Consulting, and then our local operator of TransLink here in Vancouver. For Toronto, we expand that to not only TTC, the largest transportation provider, GoTrain, and then also the Ministry of Transportation and their infrastructure group. And similarly, it will be the insights from Nexa and Crown playing within that. And the timeframes on that, we want the white paper and the triple bottom line for Toronto to be complete before the end of 2021.
Okay, next question from Simone Bisello. I'm going to try to. How would you answer the question posed by the recent Nature Climate Change article addressing the issue of electrification of light-duty vehicle fleet alone will not meet the mitigation targets, meaning current US policies are insufficient to remain within a sectoral CO2 emission budget for light vehicles consistent with preventing more than a 2-degree global warming. They acknowledge that this may not be specifically dealing with aviation, but it is a context. Do you have any response on that one?
Great point, Simone. And this is similar to what the Canadian federal government has released on our new carbon pricing scheme. We know the aviation is only one part of the overall GHG aspect, but we hope that pushing innovation to the max on both the electric and hydrogen fuel cell side can spur additional innovative technologies to not only comply with the 2-degree requirement, but continue to improve upon that. So it's not an or solution, it's how it spurs innovation throughout the system beyond just aerospace.
Very good. Now, with an earlier question asked by Pat Holst, I did get the acronyms confused. Pat was asking whether the Canadian Armed Forces, or the RCF, has a desire to buy eVTOL aircraft and spend money supporting R&D technologies. I guess he's thinking, of course, of what's happening with Agility Prime in the US, but is there any engagement in terms of Department of National Defense within this program right now?
Yes, and so thank you for that clarification, Pat. On our side, we're leaning into the National Research Council's partnership with the DND and specifically the National Guard in Canada, understanding how emergency response from either earthquake, tornado, forest fires, or northern remote Arctic operations, and how advanced air mobility can play a role. But those are very nascent conversations right now.
Okay, that's, I think, all the questions we've received from, yeah, thank you very much. One last question from my end. The zero emissions targets and strategy, is this something, is that aspirational, that's what you want to achieve, or that's where you think these technologies as employed will take the industry? In other words, is it something you see mandated or something that you see evolving out of adaption?
And this is our strongest point that we want to communicate. We understand that there will be, from the operator's perspective, a phased approach moving to zero emission operations, but we have been told very strictly from the cities and regions that we're connecting with that any introduction of new advanced air mobility technology must be on the zero emissions aspect, or else there will not be a space for us to operate in those regions. So it's setting a mandate and a bar and hurdle very high initially that we continue to lead in with operators and produce and aircraft manufacturers, saying, let's make this a reality. And in our step change and ripe opportunity for new technologies, let's start off here and continue to expand.
Very good. Well, we're coming up on our time limit here. The pace of activity from your end, Jay, over the last year and a bit has been quite phenomenal, and I suspect that in 2021 we'll see a lot more movement. In terms of tangible developments on the ground besides the isotope use case, do you have a sense of what else may occur in 2021 in terms of opportunities? Are you looking for demonstration projects, etc.?
Yes, so the one that I can mention to the group today is I'll put on my Canadian air mobility hat on the investment company side. We are currently evaluating some infrastructure investment within the British Columbia area for advanced air mobility. So not all the details available right now, but please do not hesitate to reach out if you are interested in some infrastructure aspects of the multimodal advanced air mobility operation. So that's to come in 2021 as well.
Very good. And finally, JR, the white papers, the documentation you showed on your slides, if someone wants to download the various reports that the group has produced for Vancouver, where do they go? What website do they go to get that information?
Great point to conclude on, Ken. Please take a look at our newly launched website coming up this week. It'll be CanadianAAM.com. And on there, we'll have a link to not only our current resources of the white paper and the triple bottom line analysis, but as well the join us link to be informed of all of the exciting announcements as they progress at the start of January 2021.
Very good. We're up on 1 o'clock right now. I would like to restate, JR, that Vertical Flight Society would like to very much work with you and your team in advancing VTOL applications here in Canada, and anything that we can do in terms of supporting your endeavors, please let us know. Okay, on that note, thank you everyone for attending. We had up to, I think, 60 people initially. We're down to 43, but that's a pretty good attendance from people around the world. And until next time, check out the Vertical Flight Society website and evtol.news for information on our upcoming webinars and events. Thank you again. Our biggest event will be in January, the 8th annual eVTOL symposium. This year will be held virtually, and information on that can also be found on our website. Thanks again, everyone. Over to you.